What's the first thing you think about when someone says Paris? Maybe the Eiffel Tower or the Mona Lisa. Well, here's something you might not know. Every day, more than 30,000 people try to see the Mona Lisa. That's like filling up 15 big movie theaters, all trying to see one small painting. Most people can't even get close enough to see it properly. Let me tell you about Venice too. It's a small city in Italy built on water. Only 50,000 people live there, but last year, 30 million tourists visited. Think about that. For every person who lives in Venice, 600 tourists come to visit. That's like having 600 guests try to fit into your house. You've probably seen beautiful photos of empty streets in Rome, quiet cafes in Paris, and peaceful beaches in Greece. But the truth is very different. The real streets are packed with people. The cafes are so full you can't find a seat. And those peaceful beaches, they're covered with tourists. Something big is happening in Europe's famous cities. Local people are worried. Their homes are changing. Their favorite shops are closing. And the places they love are getting too crowded to enjoy. In this video, we'll show you what's really happening in these cities. We'll talk to real people who live there. We'll look at how tourism is changing their homes. And we'll see if there's a way to fix these problems. This isn't just about tourists and vacations. It's about real cities, real people, and real problems that need fixing. Let's find out what's really going on in Europe's most visited places. Let's talk about what we see on social media versus what's really there. You know those perfect Instagram photos of the Trevi Fountain in Rome? The ones with just one person standing there making a wish? Well, here's the truth. Photographers wake up at 4 a.m. to get those shots. During normal hours, there are usually 1,500 people around that fountain. You can barely see the water through the crowd. Social media only shows us the pretty side. But let me share what happened in Barcelona last summer. Maria, who lived in the old town for 30 years, had to move out. Why? Her landlord turned her apartment building into a tourist hotel. The same thing is happening all over the city. In just 5 years, more than 10,000 local people had to leave their neighborhoods because they couldn't afford the rent anymore. Amsterdam has an even bigger problem. Regular houses are turning into Airbnb so fast that young people can't find places to live. The numbers are shocking. In the city center, 1 in every 4 homes is now a tourist rental. Think about that. In a normal street with 20 houses, 5 of them are full of tourists instead of local families. The real problem isn't just about pretty pictures versus reality. It's about how these perfect social media posts are bringing more and more people to places that are already too full. Last year, when a coffee shop in Paris went viral on TikTok, the lines got so long that local people couldn't even walk on their own sidewalk. The shop had to close for 2 weeks because things got out of control. Even small towns are feeling this pressure. In Hallstatt, Austria, a tiny town of 800 people, over 10,000 tourists show up each day in summer. They come because they saw pretty pictures on Instagram, but these photos don't show how the town's daily life has completely changed. Local kids can't ride their bikes anymore because the streets are too crowded. The small grocery store now only sells souvenirs. You might think that all these tourists mean lots of money for local people. In some ways, that's true. Tourism brings in big money. In 2023, tourists spent more than 400 billion euros in Europe. But here's the surprising part. Many local people aren't getting richer. They're actually getting poorer. Let's look at what happened in Dubrovnik, Croatia. This city became super famous after it appeared in Game of Thrones. 10 years ago, there were lots of local shops, bakeries, shoe repair stores, and family restaurants. Now, most of them are gone. Instead, you'll find Game of Thrones souvenir shops, big chain restaurants, and expensive fashion stores. The tourists come, take photos, and spend money. But most of that money goes to big companies, not local people. The same thing is happening in Venice. 20 years ago, you could find dozens of small food markets where local people bought their groceries. Today, most of these markets have closed. They've been replaced by shops selling carnival masks and glass trinkets to tourists. Local people now have to take a boat to the mainland just to buy basic things like bread and vegetables. Here's another problem: jobs. Yes, tourism creates lots of jobs, but most of them don't pay well. In Barcelona, many local people who used to own small businesses now work as waiters or hotel cleaners. They work harder but earn less money. And these jobs only last during the tourist season. In winter, many people don't have work at all. The biggest problem is with housing. When tourists are willing to pay 200 euros a night for a room, why would landlords rent to local people who can only pay 800 euros a month. In cities like Amsterdam and Lisbon, whole neighborhoods that used to be full of families are now just tourist apartments. Regular people who work as teachers, nurses, or store clerks can't afford to live in their own cities anymore. Now let's talk about what tourism does to the environment. Think about those huge cruise ships you see in Venice. Each day, one big cruise ship puts out as much air pollution as 14,000 cars. In the summer, Venice gets 3 to 4 cruise ships every day. That's like adding 42,000 extra cars to a city that doesn't even allow regular cars. The trash problem is just as bad. In summer 2023, tourists in Greece left behind so much garbage that some beaches had to close. On Santorini Island, tourists create 4 times more trash than local people. The small island's garbage trucks can't keep up. Plastic bottles and food packages often end up in the beautiful blue sea. The problem isn't just on the ground, it's in the air too. Those cheap flights that let people visit Europe for a weekend. Each flight from London to Barcelona releases as much carbon as one car does in a whole year. In 2023, there were more than 1,000 flights between just these 2 cities every week. That's a lot of pollution just so people can take quick trips. In the Alps, skiing tourists are causing big problems too. To keep ski slopes open when there's not enough snow, hotels use machines to make fake snow. These machines use lots of water and energy. Last winter, some villages in Austria ran out of water because the hotels used too much for their snow machines. Local people couldn't even take showers because all the water went to tourist activities. The beaches are suffering too. In Croatia, scientists found that popular beaches are losing their natural sand. Why? Because millions of feet walk on them every day and wear the sand away. The same beaches that tourists come to see are being destroyed by too many tourists. Here's something that might surprise you. Even the animals are having problems. In Amsterdam's parks, birds are changing their sleep patterns because tourists feed them at all hours. In the mountains of Spain, wild goats are getting sick because they eat plastic waste left by hikers. Let's talk about how tourism is changing the soul of these cities. In Salzburg, Austria, Mozart's hometown, something strange is happening. Instead of real classical music concerts, tourists now get quick 30-minute shows with musicians wearing costumes. The city that was once famous for its music is turning into a kind of Mozart-themed park. Even the chocolate shops only sell Mozart-shaped candies now. Real local traditions are disappearing fast. Take Venice's mask makers, for example. 20 years ago, you could watch skilled artists make carnival masks by hand. Today, most mask shops sell cheap copies made in China. Why? Because tourists want to pay 5 euros for a mask, not 50 euros for a real handmade one. The old craft is dying because tourists want everything cheap and quick. Food tells the same sad story. In Rome's city center, it's getting harder to find real Italian restaurants. Instead, there are tourist restaurants with pictures of pizza on the menu and waiters standing outside trying to pull people in. These places serve fast, cheap food that isn't really Italian at all. Many good local restaurants have moved to the outer parts of the city where tourists don't go. Local festivals are changing too. Barcelona's biggest street festival used to be a time when neighbors celebrated together. Now it's so crowded with tourists taking photos that local families stay home. In 2023, more than 70% of the people at the festival were tourists. Most didn't even know what they were celebrating, they just came because they saw it on social media. Even the way people live is changing. In Amsterdam's Old Town, traditional brown cafes, places where locals have met friends for hundreds of years, are turning into waffle shops and ice cream stores. These cafes were like living rooms for local people. Now, in the city center, more than half of them have closed. The places where Dutch culture lived for centuries are becoming tourist snack bars. The saddest part: young people growing up in these cities don't get to experience their own culture. In Prague, many children have never been inside the famous castle because it's always too crowded with tourists. Their city's history is becoming something they only see in books, while tourists take millions of selfies outside. Let's meet some real people whose lives have changed because of too much tourism. Maria is 72 years old and lived in the same Barcelona apartment for 45 years. Last year, her landlord told her to leave because he wanted to turn her home into tourist rooms. Now, she lives far from her friends and the neighborhood she loves. "I can't even buy bread from my favorite bakery anymore," she says. It's now a store selling Barcelona football shirts. The stress on local people is real. In Venice, doctors say more people are feeling anxious and depressed. Imagine trying to get to work, but you can't walk through your own street because of tourist crowds. Or trying to sleep at night while parties from tourist apartments keep you awake. This is normal life now for many people in tourist cities. Workers in hotels and restaurants are struggling too. Take Pedro from Lisbon. He works 12 hours a day in summer, serving tourists in a restaurant. But in winter, when tourists leave, he has no job. I can't plan my life, he says. I don't know if I'll have enough money to pay rent next month. Many workers like Pedro live this way now. Young people are leaving these cities because they can't afford to stay. In Florence, Italy, the city center has lost half its young residents in the last 10 years. They can't find normal apartments to rent because everything is on Airbnb. Teachers, nurses, and store workers, the people who keep a city running, can't afford to live where they work anymore. But the problem isn't just about money. Local friendships and communities are breaking apart. Anna from Amsterdam says, 5 years ago, I knew all my neighbors. We helped each other and had street parties. Now, every week I see different tourists in the houses next door. I don't know anyone anymore. This is happening in many tourist areas, buildings full of people, but no real neighbors. Some cities are seeing protests now. In 2023, people in Barcelona painted "Tourists Go Home" on walls. In Venice, locals held signs saying Venice is not Disneyland. They're not angry at tourists themselves, they're angry because their cities are becoming theme parks instead of real places where people live. But here's the good news, some cities are already finding solutions. Dubrovnik started something smart in 2019. They put a limit on how many tourists can enter the old city each day, just 4,000 people. Before this, sometimes 10,000 people would crowd the narrow streets. Now, locals can walk to work again, and tourists enjoy their visit more because it's not too crowded. This idea worked so well that Venice is starting the same thing in 2024. Copenhagen found a different solution. They encouraged tourists to visit other parts of the city, not just the famous spots. They made maps showing cool neighborhoods that tourists usually don't see. This helped in two ways: famous places became less crowded, and local businesses in other areas started earning more money. Now, tourists get to see the real Copenhagen, not just the tourist version. Amsterdam made a bold move. They banned new hotels and tourist shops in the city center. They also made a rule that houses can only be on Airbnb for 30 days each year. This helped local people find homes to rent again. The city feels more alive now because real people live there, not just tourists. Some cities are using clever technology too. In Barcelona, an app tells tourists which attractions are crowded and suggests better times to visit. If the Sagrada Familia is too busy, the app recommends other beautiful places nearby. This helps spread tourists around the city instead of everyone going to the same place at the same time. But the biggest change needs to come from how we travel. More people are choosing to visit cities in winter when there are fewer tourists. They stay longer in one place instead of rushing to see everything in 2 days. They pick smaller cities instead of famous ones. These simple changes help a lot. Many tourists are also starting to care more about local people. They choose small hotels run by local families instead of big chains. They eat at neighborhood restaurants instead of tourist spots. They learn a few words in the local language. Small things like this make a big difference. The future of tourism doesn't have to be bad. We can still enjoy these beautiful places without hurting them. But we need to travel differently, more carefully, more thoughtfully. Cities belong to the people who live in them. As tourists, we're just guests. And good guests try to leave places better than they found them. Remember, every big change starts with small steps. Next time you plan a trip to Europe, think about how you can be part of the solution, not part of the problem.